They didn't call him a traitor, not out loud. But when Zohran Mamdani sat down in that radio studio facing a host who wore an American flag pin the size of a nickel, the first question wasn't about policy or crime or housing. It was this: do you love this country? No smile, no context, just that. He blinked. He'd been briefed for everything crime stats, budget allocations, even counterpoints to lies he hadn't told. But not for this. Because how do you answer a question that doesn't want an answer? He said yes. Of course. Then the host tilted his head, paused for effect, and dropped the follow-up. Then why does it feel like you support someone else's flag? And for a moment, just a moment, Zohran forgot he was live. Forgot the cameras, the handlers, the headlines. He remembered his mother standing in line at the public library in Queens, holding his hand so tight he lost feeling in his pinky. She wasn't born here. But she never missed a vote. She told him once, "We don't own this country, but we can love it harder than anyone who takes it for granted." And he did. He loved it the way you love a stray dog you've nursed back to life. The way you love a place that never promised you safety, but still gave you a corner to grow in. He didn't shout, didn't argue. He simply said, if showing up for renters, for the undocumented, for the forgotten, that makes you think I'm not American, then maybe you need a new definition of patriotism. The host smiled, not kindly, just enough to say, gotcha. The segment aired that night. And the next morning, the headlines read, "Socialist Councilman Refuses to Deny Foreign Allegiance." He didn't, because there was nothing to deny, but the damage was done. In the days that followed, people didn't confront him. They avoided him. Didn't say un-American. They said divisive. Didn't say traitor. They said not like us. He'd been in office for 2 years, passed bills, blocked evictions, held funerals for neighbors who died of heat in their apartments because landlords wouldn't fix the fans. But none of that made it into the headlines. Just his name, just his face, just enough doubt. And quietly, the door that had once opened for the son of immigrants, a dancer and a historian, began to close. Not slammed shut, just gently pushed, so he couldn't quite tell if he was being asked to leave or simply no longer expected to stay. Zohran never tried to blend in. He didn't have to. He was raised in Queens, where the idea of normal came in 6 languages and 4 religions, all crammed into a 2-bedroom apartment over a laundromat. His mother was an artist who choreographed traditional Indian dance for street festivals. His father taught Islamic history at a local college. Their bookshelves were packed with Baldwin and Tagore, Emma Goldman, and Howard Zinn. They didn't teach him to be grateful for America. They taught him to build it. He learned early that he'd be questioned not for what he did, but for how he looked doing it. At school, a classmate once asked if he'd ever ridden a camel. A teacher once praised his English. A neighbor once told his mom, "You people have such strong family values. That's refreshing." And still he tried to believe that if he worked hard enough, listened carefully, followed the rules, he'd be treated like any other New Yorker. So he ran for office. Not because he wanted to change the system, but because he'd already seen it fail. Tenants who'd lived in the same building for 30 years were evicted with one notice in a language they didn't read. A halal grocer lost his store because a developer changed the zoning law overnight. A Bangladeshi mother called him in tears because her son was arrested for standing in front of his own building. These weren't statistics. These were his neighbors, and no one was fighting for them. So he knocked doors. Hundreds, thousands. Sometimes people asked if he was the intern. Sometimes they asked, "Do you even live here?" But most times they invited him in, told him about mold, about mice, about rent that rose faster than paychecks. He listened, and he promised nothing he couldn't do. And they voted. He won. A son of Ugandan immigrants with a last name the newspapers couldn't pronounce without double-checking elected to office in the most diverse place in America. At first he thought that meant the system worked, that maybe this country did have room for people like him if they just tried hard enough. Then came the backlash. The city council meetings got colder. Colleagues stopped making eye contact. One longtime ally told him off the record, "You've got good ideas, but your name makes people nervous." He laughed, at first, Then he stopped, because the pattern was becoming clear. The more visible he became, the more invisible his work became. He could pass bills, fight evictions, mobilize entire blocks. But all the media saw was his radical stance, his foreign-sounding views, his unwillingness to play nice. And when he pushed for stronger housing protections, the mayor's office leaked a memo Mamdani is too extreme for moderate voters. He wasn't shocked, but it still stung, because for the first time he realized he wasn't being criticized. He was being contained. Not defeated, just boxed out. His staff stopped getting callbacks. His proposals got buried in committees. And slowly his name stopped appearing in press releases even when he sponsored the work. He was still in the room, but now no one was looking at him. It's hard to name the moment when silence becomes strategy. When people stop calling not because they're busy, but because your presence now requires explanation. When once friendly colleagues start saying things like, "We need to be pragmatic" or "optics matter," without ever naming what exactly looks so wrong. It wasn't sudden. First, a speaking slot at a housing conference quietly disappeared. Then a reporter who had once quoted him regularly stopped returning emails. Even allies in his own party began to offer cautious distance. "We agree with you," they'd say, "but we have to win re-election." He wasn't losing fights. He just wasn't being invited to them. He noticed his name dropped from planning meetings. His emails were copied less often. A city agency director he had worked with for months told him, "We need a fresh face for this press opportunity." And then came the messages, subtle but coordinated. Op-eds that called him divisive. Articles that framed his policies as too far too fast. Mentions of activist lawmakers with questionable priorities. No direct attacks, just enough context to discredit, just enough repetition to stick. In his inbox, the hate mail increased. He was called a sleeper cell, a plant, an enemy of the American dream. He didn't reply, didn't fight back. Because what would that prove? He'd learned something dangerous. You don't need to be shouted down to be erased. You just need to be slowly rewritten. And that's what it felt like. Every action he took was now viewed through a different lens. Not, does this policy help working-class New Yorkers? But why is he the one pushing it? Even when his proposals mirrored ideas from respected lawmakers only, his came with scrutiny. When he quoted data, they called it ideology. When he told stories, they called it propaganda. When he showed up, they called it a distraction. And behind closed doors, the whisper campaign grew louder. He makes it harder for the rest of us. He's not wrong, but he brings the wrong attention. He's too much of a symbol, not enough of a team player. Zohran heard these comments secondhand, never directly. That was the design. No one wanted to be seen as the person who pushed him out. They just wanted him to step aside on his own. One day, his own aide, someone who'd worked with him from the beginning, handed in her resignation. She looked at him kindly and said, "It's not you, it's just, you know." And he did, because by then he'd stopped asking why. The better question was what now? Not what could he say to fix it, but what could he do when the room already decided to look elsewhere? He didn't call a press conference, didn't go on TV to clear his name. There were no viral videos, no angry rebuttals, no desperate op-eds with titles like "What I Really Meant." Instead, he walked the stairs of a building on 34th Avenue, a building where tenants were still waiting for heat in February. He'd been there before, during the campaign, promised to return, and now no cameras followed. But he came anyway. One of the tenants, Miss Dela Cruz, blinked when she saw him. "I thought you got too famous for us," she said. He smiled. "Fame's temporary. Rent is not." They sat on milk crates in a hallway where the lights flickered every 10 seconds. She told him nothing had changed. The super stopped showing up. The landlord didn't answer. So he took notes, called the housing department, helped her file another complaint. Not because it would fix everything, but because doing nothing was never an option. That week he visited 5 more buildings, all ones he'd been to before. No fanfare, no entourage. Just him, a folder, and a beat-up messenger bag. And word began to spread. Not on social media, not in political circles, but in stairwells, at bodegas, between neighbors. "Zohran's back. He never left. He helped me again." A few weeks later, a handwritten letter arrived at his office. It was from a 13-year-old named Ibrahim. "My dad says we still have our apartment because of you," it read. "I don't know what socialism is, but I know you came." He pinned the letter on his wall, next to the one from a tenant in Jackson Heights who had lost her brother to COVID, and who told him, "You were the only one who returned my call." This wasn't the comeback anyone expected. It didn't trend, it didn't explode, it just continued. A quiet, deliberate return to the one place they couldn't erase him from the people who still remembered what he had done. Not what they said he represented, but who he showed up for over and over again. A journalist who once wrote a critical piece about him requested a follow-up interview, not for a profile, just a quote for a story on housing reform. Zohran almost declined, not out of pride, but because he knew how the game worked. Say too little, and he'd be called evasive. Say too much, and they'd pick the loudest sentence out of context. But something in the journalist's voice, hesitant, not slick, made him pause. They met at a diner in Elmhurst. No camera crew, just a notebook and a cup of coffee gone cold too fast. She asked about legislation. He answered plainly. Then she asked about the narrative. "Do you think people misunderstood you?" He took a breath. "I think people needed a villain, and I wasn't famous enough to be untouchable." She scribbled, but didn't interrupt. He went on. Told her about Maria, the woman who had been tricked into signing away her rent-stabilized lease by a developer's agent. She spoke only Spanish. No one translated the letter. By the time she understood, it was too late. She had lived there for 27 years, he said, and one signature erased all of it. He wasn't crying, but his voice slowed. Not with anger, with weight. The journalist closed her notebook. "I didn't know about her." He nodded. "Most people don't." She asked if he had a photo. He did. Not one for public use. Just a shot of Maria and her granddaughter planting basil in a window box on the fire escape. "I don't need to be the story," he said, "but if you're writing about housing, write about her." The next day the article ran with a different title than expected: "The Councilman Who Stayed." It didn't make front page, but it changed something, because for the first time his name was printed beside a face other than his own. Not a slogan, not a label, just a woman named Maria, and the man who had shown up for her quietly after the cameras had moved on. The room was packed. A public hearing on rent caps the kind of meeting that usually drew bureaucrats and tired aides. But this time the cameras came. So did the critics. Across from Zohran sat Councilman Richard Hartley, three-term incumbent law and order conservative suit, starched like his rhetoric. He opened with a smile designed to disarm. "Mr. Mamdani," Hartley said, "we all want affordable housing, but the question is, do you understand what this country needs?" A few chuckles from his side of the aisle, the kind that said, "We've got him." Zohran didn't flinch, didn't lean forward, just met the stare and replied, "I do, because I knock on doors. I don't get driven past them." The room quieted. Hartley tried again. "Your bill would limit how much landlords can raise rent. That's not freedom, that's government overreach." Zohran didn't quote Marx. He quoted Maria. She was told her rent would go up 30% in 1 year. She earns $24,000 annually. Is that her freedom to choose between groceries and staying housed? Hartley shifted in his seat. Someone in the audience coughed. Another nodded. Zohran continued. "Freedom isn't theoretical. It's whether your child does homework under a roof that still belongs to you by morning." Hartley raised an eyebrow. "That's a dramatic way to frame it." Zohran nodded slowly. "It's dramatic because it's real." He paused. "You see it as policy. I see it as people." For the first time that day, Hartley didn't respond. Zohran took one breath, then added, not for Hartley, but for the room. "I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to meet the people I represent." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because silence filled the room louder than applause. The silence lingered. Then Councilman Hartley cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone. "I understand the theater of this, Mr. Mamdani, but I represent real constituents, working families, people who want safety order American values." He gestured to the audience. "You say you knock doors. I say whose doors?" Zohran didn't reply, because before he could, a woman stood up in the third row. She looked about 60. Gray hair in a loose bun, wore a windbreaker with a faded Reagan Bush 84 pin still clipped to the collar. "I'm one of his doors," she said loud enough for the mic to pick it up. The room turned. Hartley smiled, but cautiously. "Ma'am, this isn't open comment." She ignored him. "My name's Evelyn Carver. I've lived in Astoria since 1975. I voted for Reagan twice and Bush 3 times. I go to church. I fly the flag. And I've been trying to keep my daughter and 2 grandkids housed since her husband died last winter." She looked straight at Zohran. He showed up. Not with slogans, with paperwork, with phone numbers, with a jacket when the heat broke. Now she turned to Hartley. "You talk about values, but the only one who came to our building was him." Someone clapped once, then another. Hartley tried to speak, but the mic crackled, as if the room itself wanted him to stop. Evelyn wasn't done. "I didn't vote for him because we're the same. I voted for him because he came back." She sat down. And in that moment, no campaign video, no speech, no social media post could compete with what just happened. Because it wasn't about being right. It was about being remembered. And Zohran didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The clip of Evelyn's speech made its way online that night. Not from a news station. From someone's phone, slightly shaky audio, uneven but clear enough. The caption was simple. He showed up. Within 24 hours, the video had 100,000 views. Not viral by internet standards, but enough to shift the weather. The next morning, Zohran's inbox was full again. Not with hate, with names. People offering testimonies, photos of broken elevators, lease documents, stories. It wasn't a redemption arc. There was no headline that read, "We were wrong." But the silence broke. A local radio host invited him on not to interrogate, but to listen. A neighborhood newspaper ran a profile. The councilman who brings a clipboard, not a microphone. Even the city's largest daily, which had once called him a disruptive voice, quietly updated its language to progressive lawmaker from Queens. He didn't celebrate. He went back to work. Helped an undocumented tenant appeal a surprise eviction, testified on a sanitation bill that nobody else wanted to touch, visited a 6th grade civics class where a boy with braces and a shy voice asked, "Does it hurt when people don't like you?" Zohran smiled. "It hurts when I stop doing the work, not when people stop clapping." That afternoon, a letter arrived in his office. No return address. Just handwriting in cursive, shaky but deliberate. "We've never met. I didn't vote for you, but I saw the way you listened to Evelyn Carver, and I think that's what public service is supposed to be. No name, no ask. Just a sentence that said, 'I'm watching. Keep going.'" He pinned it next to Ibrahim's letter, next to Maria's photo, next to the memo they once leaked calling him too extreme. Because now the rooms that once stopped looking at him were starting to look again. Not because he yelled, not because he rebranded, but because he stayed. Zohran never got a trophy. No most improved label from the press. No invite to late-night shows or podcasts. He wasn't trending. But one evening as he walked out of a tenant meeting where only 7 people showed up, but each had a folder and a fear, a boy stopped him on the sidewalk. Couldn't have been more than 12. Glasses, hoodie, nervous smile. "Are you the guy on TV?" the boy asked. Zohran smiled. "Sometimes." The boy reached into his backpack and pulled out a notebook. Showed him a page. On it was a drawing rough but clear. A council chamber, tiny desks, and in the middle a figure with brown skin and big glasses standing alone. Underneath it, the boy had written, "The one who doesn't look like the others." Zohran looked at it for a long time. "You drew this?" he asked. The boy nodded. "My teacher said government people don't look like us. But you kind of do." He didn't ask for an autograph. Didn't take a selfie. Just handed over the page and said, "My mom said thank you for the help with the gas bill. She says we can stay warm this winter." Then he ran off before Zohran could reply. He stood there a minute longer holding the page. The drawing was a little crooked. The caption wasn't entirely kind, but it was honest. And in that moment it felt heavier than applause. Because what he'd built quietly, stubbornly, wasn't fame. It was permission. Permission for someone else to imagine themselves in the room. to believe that they didn't have to sound right or look right or wait until they were invited. They could just show up and stay. Years from now, there may be no statue, no school named after him, no day on the calendar where they say this is the man who changed the city. And that's fine, because Zohran Mamdani didn't run for legacy. He ran because he knew what it felt like to be unseen and decided no one else should feel that invisible. And when they tried to erase him, he didn't fight louder. He stood still. He made his case not with slogans, but with presence. Not with viral rage, but with relentless return. And in doing so, he proved something that's easy to forget in politics and in life. You don't have to win the argument to win the moment. You don't have to dominate the room to be remembered. Sometimes just being there when others won't is enough. Because someone will notice. Someone always does. And for every headline that fades, there is a face that remembers. A tenant who didn't lose her lease. A father who got to stay near his kids. A boy with a notebook who now knows the room isn't just for the others. Zohran may never be called the American ideal, but he is something rarer. He is proof. Months later, another council candidate sat in that same radio studio, same desk, same flag pin, same host, and the question came right on cue. Do you love this country? This time it wasn't aimed at Zohran. It was aimed at a young woman. Black, 29, public defender. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She said, "I love it enough to fight for the people it keeps forgetting." And outside the studio, watching from a quiet corner, Zohran smiled. Not because he'd won, but because someone else didn't have to explain why she belonged. Someone else didn't have to translate her love of country into a language more palatable. He walked down the hall, past interns, past staffers, past people who wouldn't recognize him without the headlines. And that was fine, because this story was never about being famous. It was about staying when you're told you don't fit, about showing up when it's easier to walk away, about leaving the door open just long enough for someone else to step through. So if you've ever felt out of place, mispronounced, misread, if you've ever been asked to prove your love for a country that hasn't always loved you back, share this story. Not for Zohran, but for the next name on the ballot, the next kid with a notebook, the next Evelyn Carver waiting in a hallway for someone who won't forget her address.